Hello, I'm Jacqueline Holstead, and you are listening to On Point Conversations. In this podcast series, we share creative marketing, content, and branding strategies that help your business successfully navigate the new normal marketing environment. And I'm Jacqueline Holstead, and today on my podcast on Point Conversations, I'm going to take a little bit of a detour from the community podcasts I've been doing talking about community. I want to get back to that. That's really important to me, and I can see some really good areas to talk about there. So I will be getting back to that topic in subsequent podcasts. But today I want to kind of take a little bit of a fun detour. For me, it's kind of fun, and there's lessons to be learned too. In marketing, as with any profession and anything, but I'm a marketing expert, so I'm more in the marketing field. Through the years, we use terms, either they're acronyms or terms or words, to describe specific areas of marketing. And as I do when I work with clients, I work with various people. Sometimes I work with human resources, sometimes it's engineers, different types of engineers, and engineering mostly, actually, it's engineers from all across the spectrum. When I do that, I realized a long time ago that I don't want to dumb down the conversation, but I want to make it really clear what I'm talking about, because sometimes those words are not things that are in the engineering vernacular. They're not in the HR vernacular. In fact, they have other words that they use. So with acronyms, what I generally do is I don't use them. I spell it out at least the first time, and in communication it's probably the first time, and then I might parenthesis it the information of this is the acronym. And I do that so that people, number one, know what I'm talking about, because it does me no good to present or to try to get across an idea or to try to basically promote an idea when they don't understand. And very seldom will I find somebody who will say, I don't get what that word means. They assume they're supposed to know what it means, and we act like there's an assumption they should know what it means, and they don't. And I see that also with engineering when they use acronyms for me. Now, I'm open enough to say I'm not an engineer, so I don't understand that acronym. But many people are not going to be asking and opening themselves up to looking like they don't know what we're talking about. So kind of the funny part is I found this. I love old books, and so I found some old books, and they're old college textbooks or books on communication. I often like seeing how actually maybe words have changed, but not the actual concept of communication. But I found this in one of the books, and it's called Arnold Compiles Axioms for Newspaper Typography. Now, granted, there are not a lot of printed newspapers around anymore. We still have one in our community, which is pretty unique. And there's still printed newspapers, but mostly I think we're moving, especially those people who can, move to online communication so you have less paper. So this relates to newspaper advertising. So some of the things that are in here, and this was Dr. Edmund Arnold. He was from Syracuse University, a professor and author of 15 journalism textbooks, and he compiled the Arnold's axiom. Now, I don't know, there's no date on this, so I don't know what year it was. It's yellowed paper, so it could be quite old, although paper yellows quite quickly. But for example, under nameplates and covers, they refer to a nameplate. And he says, adequate nameplate, but not particularly handsome. Nameplate, difficult to read when surprinted on photographic background. Now, I don't know what a nameplate is. I get the assumption it's a headline, except in the next series he goes through on headlines. He says downstyle heads have highest legibility. Set all heads from the same family of type. I think people would understand that. And then art headings should harmonize with each other throughout. And it goes on, actually, I won't bother you with it, but there's one on tombstones. Avoid tombstone heads side by side. Then he goes on and he does one on pictures, which we more commonly call photos now, but he talks about run pictures as large as you can, and every picture must be identifiable. Those are good things to do. And then he goes into body type, which we might call text or content. And he talks about Romans has the best readability. Well, we can understand that. Although if you're not in the business, you'll want to give people a visual cue of what you mean when you're talking about certain type phrases. There are ways to do this really well, and that is, again, by offering a verbal, but also a visual cue. So you're looking at it at the same time that the people are reviewing it. So, for example, if you're reviewing an ad, you can talk about this headline says this, and on through. They will understand that part of it. And then the last one I'm going to go through, it's layout. Always pyramid ads to write. Keep page simple. Circus makeup confuses the reader. So in other words, you can tell that these are words we don't use today. They're older words. There are words we use today that I think can be confusing to our audience. So when I am doing this, I do this too. When I'm presenting a concept, an idea, copy to a client, I'm careful to be sure that, number one, I don't use acronyms that they might not even understand what I'm saying. I don't necessarily use idioms. I don't necessarily use words that are used in our field but are not understandable by everybody else. They might be understandable. They might make, we might talk about the customer pyramid, or we might talk about the buying cycle. And those are things that you'd go, well, I get what those are. I understand that. But I've seen, 5 or 6 versions of the buying cycle. So when you're talking to someone who is new to working with you, it would be a good idea to explain, if you're talking about the buying cycle and where you are in the cycle, it's a good idea to have those steps outlined so that they know what the steps are. Because as I said, I've seen 5 or 6 different types of buying cycles. There are other terms that I won't go really into today, but I'm just saying, be sure that when you're working with your audience, that and you're not dumbing it down. I'm not saying that you're putting it to a point where people are thinking you're talking to a preschool class, because that would be irritating too. I'm talking about a point where you're making sure that the words you're using are not necessarily specific to just a marketing group. Now, sometimes if you're presenting in a presentation to a group of many people, like the C-suite, you can use those words, but you want to pair them up with what you're talking about in a very subtle way. So again, you're not dumbing it down, but you're making sure that everyone in your audience is getting the communication properly. I know probably many of you have done this. I've done this. I've been in a meeting. I've heard the exact same speaker that everyone else heard. I heard everything they said. I feel like I'm a very good listener. And I get out of the meeting and I might put together notes, because sometimes I do, or I might send out something that says, because for client notes, generally in a client meeting, I will send out action items or whatever. And I might get feedback that says, I didn't hear that in the meeting. So I might second guess myself, but again, I'm thinking, well, we heard something different. And it's a good idea, back to action plan, when you do put it in writing, because people do then tend to see, like, where is the discrepancy? So you don't end up getting into the next meeting, which is an update meeting, and something wasn't done, or somebody had an idea that it should have been done and it wasn't done, that kind of thing. But as I'm saying, communication, I think it's really interesting. It's one of the things that I studied in college and I keep up to all the time, and I get really watched for communication gaps, for one. Very cognizant of the fact that I want clients to understand what I'm talking about. But I also know that communication issues happen. So, and it's particularly when you're working with a large group and you don't have the option of being one-on-one, which is often the case when you're working with large companies. You've got a meeting that has 12 people in. They're all from different parts of the discipline. And so you don't know who really, you have an idea, because you're going to ask in the beginning of the meeting, who's in the meeting. You're going to have a good idea whether your contact has given you all the people who are in the meeting, and then you want to review. That's a aside here, but when you have these large meetings, generally you're going to have a client on the other side who's putting them together. So ask that person who all is going to be in the meeting, their names, and what their particular function is. So if you get in a meeting where you have people who are from accounting, and you have people from marketing, and you have people from sales, you can gear the presentation so that you are covering those things that those people would want to hear. You'll be having to think about it from a different angle with different disciplines. There's another part for communication, and that's communication barriers. And that's a little bit harder when you're dealing with different cultures. So when I'm dealing with a different culture, what I generally do is I employ or I consult with a person who has a better idea of that culture than I do. I don't know all the cultures. And I want to know, if I'm working with a different company, what protocol is, not only what protocol is, but also what are some of the communications issue, what are some of the words I should avoid, what are some of the things, so that if you have somebody on your side, not necessarily that's either the client or somebody in the meeting, but someone outside who can be your outside consultant in these culture areas, I find that to be very helpful because we're not all on the same page sometimes. And there are political things that we need to be aware of, but there's also just things from a cultural standpoint that it's good to be aware of. The other thing is that there can be communications barriers when people do not want to hear what you want to say. I find that comes more into play when you're in a situation where you're not necessarily agreeing, and this happens all the time, with your client or with whoever you're presenting to. So be sure that at that point you have thought way ahead of time and you've prepared to know some of the objections you're going to get, some of the things you're going to get, and how you want to communicate so you're as clear as possible. Will you always win those? No. Will you always never have a change? A client doesn't have a change? No. Will you run up into cases, and I've done this, where I presented something, it's a photo. It is a photo of, I particularly think of this, it's a photo of a drop of water. And the person who was in the C-suite who was reviewing it felt that it looked fake. So I was going to pull back the photo and put in a different one, but the creative team really wanted to keep this photo. So they changed it and they changed it and they changed it until it really did look fake, and we ended up replacing the photo. And that would have been a lesson to learn in the beginning, that he communicated to us a barrier he had to that photo, which could never be corrected. It was just not a photo he liked. I ran into this recently too on some typeface that is on a certain website that I'm working with these clients. And the typeface, I mean, I'm fine with the typeface. I thought it was fine. But when we got into the meeting with the whole C-suite and everyone, one of the people who is a decision maker felt the typeface was too light, too small, too everything. And it really wasn't. But I think we just went ahead and worked together and changed the typeface to a different typeface, and it was fine. That was fine. That worked fine. So it wasn't worth spending a lot of time on. It was worth listening to his communication. So I bounced around a lot today. I hope I've made some lessons for you that you might learn from. Basically, what I'm getting at is look at the terms you're using, think about them carefully, see if you're throwing these words out and your client or the person that really needs to understand what you're talking about doesn't understand, because if they don't understand, they are either going to approve something they never wanted in the beginning, or they are going to end up disproving it or taking it and rejecting it for all kinds of reasons that you're not going to understand, because it's just in general, they don't understand. And people don't like to say, I don't understand, can you explain that to me? So, and keep acronyms very at a minimum. I see them all the time. I used to have work with Hewlett Packard, and I would have a set of acronyms that everybody in my team had to have in order to know what people were talking about. that's another case of just acronyms. And when it's the client's acronyms, you do have to learn what they are. But you can stay as far away from them as you can and make it your information and communication very readable. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great day, and I'll be back on talking about community in subsequent podcasts. Again, this is Jacqueline Holstead, On Point Conversations. Thank you for listening, and I invite you to join me next week as we talk more about specific actions you can take to reach your own business goals. You can find my library of other inspiring podcasts like this one at onpointthinking.com. Again, thank you for listening. This is Jacqueline Holstead at On Point Conversations.